For the second time in as many years, Joe Douglas finds himself head-to-head with a hard negotiator, this time edge rusher Haason Reddick. Some good news for Izzy Abanikanda, and taking a look at a few potential trade chips that Gang Green may have at the poker table. I'm Glenn Naughton with JetNation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. So Joe Douglas, the Haason Reddick situation, we've talked about it quite a bit. And I've kind of said all along, quite confidently, Reddick's got no leverage. The Jets hold all the chips, especially as Will McDonald continues to play well. We also, week one, had the near sack. I mean, it got to the quarterback in under a second and a half. QB just got rid of the ball. Then he got a sack last week. Then we see him practice today. He got to Aaron Rodgers another time or two. So Will McDonald is just consistently getting to the quarterback, whether it's against the Jets O-line or opposing O-lines. So he's doing enough to ease some of the concerns that some folks may have had about him not being able to get to the QB. And I get it. It's preseason. It's practice. This doesn't cement him as anything. And I'm not saying he's a 10-sack guy this year. But you'd rather see him doing this than Will McDonald doing nothing. We've had enough years of that, of players showing up to camp doing absolutely nothing, which usually translates to absolutely nothing. But when you're playing the way he is, there's something there. But Will McDonald playing well, Haason Reddick holding out. Who knows how long this thing goes on? How much money is Reddick willing to lose? Because he is going to lose a lot. But as I was thinking about this the other day and how confident I felt, that I've just been kind of writing this off like this is just Reddick being silly, and Joe Douglas knows he holds all the cards. He has no reason to give in. He has no reason to say, all right, man, what do you want? How much of a raise is this going to take before you're willing to come in and practice? Because that's the whole stalemate, right? The whole issue is the Jets claim, or, through Connor Hughes, the Jets claim their understanding was that Reddick would come in and practice. Once camp started, he would be there. He said as much at his presser. I believe, he said something along the lines of, whatever the contract is, I'll be here regardless. That's the kind of guy I am. So kind of putting his character out there is the reason why he'll be there. And he's not there. So again, that's the Jets version of events. Reddick's camp has apparently sort of contradicted this through Diana Rossini. I haven't seen the story yet, but I've discussed it with a couple of people, and I heard it mentioned again today on a podcast I was listening to, talking about the Reddick situation. And as confident as I am that the Jets are just going to sit and wait Haason Reddick out, which is what they may do. I think back to the last time I was this confident that Joe Douglas held all the cards in a negotiation. And that was last year with Aaron Rodgers. And, people got mad when I said it at the time. They might get mad now. Don't care. Like, the truth is the truth. And the Jets were always the only team bidding for Rodgers. Green Bay had zero other offers. Zero. None. Not one other team was offering a single thing. The Jets were the only buyer. And the Packers were on the hook for $100 million for a guy they wanted to get rid of. In my opinion, Joe Douglas caved. He gave up too much. Obviously, thrilled Rodgers is here. But part of the reason I gave was not only are you the only bidder, the quarterback's a little older. He might get hurt. And, we all know how that went. But listen, let's win a Super Bowl or two and no one's going to give a damn. I get it. But an overpay is an overpay. When you're the only buyer and the other team is not just interested in trading, determined, desperate to trade a guy, as they were with Rodgers. They had one buyer and they still managed to get high value picks out of Joe Douglas. So Douglas said in an interview after the trade, I believe is with Pro Football Talk. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. PFW, PFT, one of those. And he was asked, why did you give Green Bay what they want? And Joe Douglas just kind of said, well, they were insistent. To which my thought was, well, why weren't you equally insistent on not giving up the pick? Again, you could have run it all the way up to the moment of you being on the clock on draft day to try to pressure the Packers. But anyway, that's in the past. But Douglas did eventually cave and say, all right, yes, we're the only buyer. Yes, this is an older player with an increased injury risk. No, you don't have any other suitors. Or sorry, no, you're not able to pay him $100 million because then you have to play him. But you've got to find out what you have in Jordan Love. So the Packers really had to make that move. And Douglas still gave him what they wanted. He caved. Now, does he cave this time? And is it up to him? We've talked about this on a couple of shows recently where the Jets, it's not as if Joe Douglas doesn't have a boss, right? It's not as if We don't know if Woody Johnson or Jaime Elhai, who works with the Johnsons, team president, they could be the ones sitting there saying, we're not giving this guy $28 million a year without seeing him first, without getting some level of commitment. Show up to work. And listen, I know every player handles things differently, so it's not really fair to make it an apples to apples comparison. I mean, it kind of is, but again, you can't expect every guy to act like every guy. But if you hadn't heard, Matthew Judon, who the Patriots traded, same reason, wanted more money. Now, Judon was having a hold in, which, yeah, that's better. You're in the building, you're at meetings, but you're still not getting ready for the season physically, which is the big thing. But Judon was traded to Atlanta and said today, like, I have no history with these guys. They don't know me. I'm in no position to ask for more money from them. I got to prove it, which is exactly what the Jets are asking from Haason Reddick. But the more this drags out, the more you start to wonder. The last time Joe Douglas held all the cards, he got to a point where he was like, okay, let's just do this. Give them the draft picks they want. Is he going to do the same thing this time? My gut feeling says no, he won't. But I also am not 100% convinced he's the only guy making this decision. As I said, he's got bosses. And the Jets are always willing to spend, right? There's this false narrative out there that the Jets are cheap. Just look at the money they've spent over the years. They're always around the cap, around maxed out cap-wise. Now, in terms of cash spending over the next few years, they've got really none on the books. However, we all know what's coming. Sauce, Garrett, Brees, JJ, Michael Carter. I mean, those guys are all coming up on deals. And who knows? Listen, if I've said it before, if Sauce Gardner gets all pro again this year, even if he doesn't, I think he comes to the Jets for a new deal. And not Sauce, his agents. And as I said, that's their job. If you have a player who's that good playing at that level in this market, you don't sit back and say, yeah, man, we're going to wait till that 5th year, let them exercise that option, and then we'll talk to them about a new deal. No, you're not doing your job. It's the job of the agent when you have a player who's playing at Sauce Gardner's level. And Garrett Wilson, when he puts up 1,500 yards this year, Jermaine Johnson, if he goes out and gets a double-digit sack season, which will be tough. We've talked about this. The Jets rotate guys. Double-digit sacks is tough. But either way, if these guys, and Brees, we talked about this. He's easily, I'm going to be really, I'll say he's a top 5 running back. Wink, wink. He's top 2. And he might be 1 after this year. If this O-line blocks for him, and he's got a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers keeping defenses honest, he might be the most productive back in the NFL this year, as long as he stays on the field. We've seen that issue with him before, right? But the Jets are about to have a whole bunch of money to spend, and that may be why they're a little hesitant with Reddick. But again, the hesitancy, I'm not sure it's 100% on Joe Douglas, but I do think that there are others, involved in determining whether or not this money gets given out. Dave O'Rourke. Dave, how are we doing, buddy? Good man, Dave. Let's see. Evening, so many big decisions for Joe D in the next year or two. Huge decisions. Huge. Teams tend to not pay running backs. But if Brees Hall hits his ceiling this year and goes out and runs for 1,400 yards and has, another chunk receiving, you're going to let him walk? And listen, you got more than, he's going into year 3. He's got more time on his deal. But if he plays well enough, he could ask for a new deal. Any of these guys after year 3, when they blow up, that's why the whole, they took this guy in the first round, they have 5 years of control. That's not always the case. Guys can ask for deals early. And you know who asks for deals early? Guys who were playing great. So it's sort of the one downside to drafting well, right? All right, look at all these great picks. And I'm not complaining. Don't get me wrong. We've had enough years of terrible drafting to it's finally nice to see some quality drafting here. But Joe Douglas, again, is going to have this decision to make with Reddick. Again, my feeling is if I had to guess right now, the Jets wait him out and Reddick shows up by week 1. Now, does that mean he's ready? No. Like they say, you hear guys say, I'm staying in shape. I wasn't in camp, but I was at home working out, or went to my college and worked out, or my high school field and worked out. Great. You know what you didn't do? Play NFL football. And you know how you get ready to do that? By playing NFL football. So it'll be a little while till he's ready if he shows up week one. Do the Jets say, let's not even get into that. Let's not even get into how much he plays, when he plays. All we will know is that if Reddick shows up week one and doesn't play right away, and we've talked about this in previous shows, that could be beneficial to the Jets because, as we know, the escalators or the triggers on the deal, the trade compensation requires percentage of snaps played, I believe 65, and double-digit sacks for that 3 to become a 2. Now, if you're a Jets fan, you don't want it to be a 2. And if he misses the first couple games and at the rate that the Jets rotate out, he's not hitting 65%. That's just not going to happen. So the Jets could end up, that could be the silver lining in this whole situation. But of course, the concern, and I've mentioned this before, is the injuries, because we've seen many times before where players hold out, come into camp late, try to do too much too soon, and they end up missing time and obviously spending a lot more time on the bench than you had planned. One guy who didn't spend much time on the bench this past week and did a nice job. Not great, didn't set the world on fire, but a guy that I'm excited to see play well, Izzy Abanikanda, second-year running back out of Pitt. I've talked about Abanikanda a fair bit, be it on our shows, some of the articles I've written for JetNation, and I've openly said I have an Izzy Abanikanda bias because I loved Izzy out of Pitt. Not going to try to hide that. I thought super explosive guy, can be a home run threat from anywhere on the field. Jets apparently last year didn't like the fact he wasn't running hard enough up the middle, getting those tough yards. But listen, he's a guy who probably spent his whole life just outrunning dudes. And then he gets to the NFL where he'll be able to do some of that, but you can't rely on that every play. You can't just expect to have wide open holes and just, rocket launch yourself into the end zone. You got to get some tough yards. And that's what the Jets have asked of Izzy Abanikanda. I didn't like his chances to make the roster when they drafted a second running back. Since taking Isaiah Davis, I've been sort of grasping at straws and trying to think of a way that he can make the roster as a fourth running back. But really, as long as he keeps playing well, and if Isaiah Davis ends up being the special teams guy or that it appears he's going to be, I think he has a shot. And I'm thrilled about that. Part of it was sort of just sort of when you have a player that you're high on, that you liked out of college and your team ends up with them, you hate to see them go, and especially when you don't know yet, when they haven't had the reps, they haven't had the opportunity to show what they can do. You want them to get that shot. And Izzy really got a handful of carries last year. Now he's getting some preseason carries behind, backup linemen. But I feel like he's making the most of it. And I think you put Izzy behind the Jets' current line, the starting line, and I think it's a different story. I think you see him pop some big runs. So as long as the Jets see that too, it could be that Izzy Abanikanda hangs around, which would be fantastic. David says again, what a difference the roster pre-JD to this training camp. He hasn't been perfect, but I feel he's done a great job improving the quality and depth. Couldn't agree more, David. I've talked about this before, till I'm blue in the face, and I'm kind of done saying it, although I'm sure it'll be mentioned again. For some reason with Joe Douglas, folks that don't like him only want to point to the negative. I don't know how many different ways I can explain. Every GM misses. Every GM has busts. Every GM signs guys who don't work out. Every GM drafts guys who don't work out. Every GM makes trades that don't go as well as they'd hoped. This is life in the NFL for every GM, all of them. Look at Ozzie Newsome's last year. It's been a while since I looked, but I remember even Ozzie Newsome had a stretch where, he said himself, this isn't my standard. And the Ravens had like a 3-year run where they didn't produce much through the draft. And this is Ozzie Newsome, arguably the best ever. So guys miss. We did a show, Dylan Turman and I, a few months ago where we broke down every single Joe Douglas draft pick, looked at it objectively, categorized hits, misses, question marks, who's the jury still out on, what constitutes a hit, what constitutes a miss. You have guys who play a little bit. The numbers, and it was interesting to find the article that I used for that podcast, because the number I'd always heard for years, listening to G, like when I lived in the States and had Sirius XM, and I'd always listen to the after the lunchtime drive, whatever it was, with Pat Kerwin. And they would always say that, GMs generally say you miss on just over 50% of your picks. And then I find this article that was done, I think it was done by a fan who was a writer, and he researched like 20 years, and bang on, 52% of picks bust, are out of the league and never contribute. That's the average. So on average, GMs will miss on more than half their picks. So right off the bat, 52% you expect to not make it. Then when you get into the guys who contribute a little, to solid backups, to solid starter, all the way up to elite player, when you break down Joe Douglas's draft classes, he's probably about average in terms of hit rate, but his blue chip rate is phenomenal. And the guys I mentioned, right? You have the big four, but you also have Michael Carter, who's one of the best nickels in the league. You have Joe Tippmann, who was all rookie last year. Like, these are guys who are high-level starters. Now, Tippmann, I should back off. It's 1 year. He's got to prove more. But I have every faith. Bernard, how we doing? Thanks for chiming in. I have every confidence that Joe Tippmann will be a stud center. So if you look at not just Joe Douglas's hit rate, but how many elite players he's found, and I have a whole lot of confidence that Olu Fashanu is going to be another one. And, not as confident in Malachi Corley, but I think Corley's going to be an excellent player. So, yeah, if you just look at sheer hit rate, Joe Douglas is around average. If you look at what percentage of his picks are high-level elite starters, it's higher than most. So he finds about as many starters as most GMs. And here's the other thing with Douglas. And I'm glad you brought him up, Dave, because this is a point that, and I talked about this earlier this offseason. I asked the question, has Joe Douglas become a better GM by avoiding some character concerns? Right? And what I mean by that is you look at a couple of the picks that he's made in the past that you would have to consider a miss because they're no longer on the Jets. So if we're being honest with ourselves, it's a miss. But when you ask the question, are these guys quality NFL players? Are they anywhere from backup to starter to high level? Then all of a sudden, you look and you say, Jason Pinnock's a starter, or he was last year. I haven't looked at the Giants depth chart. Jason Pinnock, starting safety. And Pinnock was let go because they signed Tony Adams as an undrafted free agent. They liked him better. But you drafted Pinnock, who's good enough to, at the very least, he's going to be a backup. Right? So there's an NFL player you found. Michael Carter. We'll talk about him later this year. But I think Michael Carter is going to surprise some people this year. I think he was disheartened by the way things went with the Jets. He's a human being. He was being asked to sit on the bench behind a guy who had nothing in the tank. And let's see. Bernard says, disagree. The play might be Rodgers' fault, but the injury was not. It was just bad luck. Yeah, and regardless of the reason, Bernard, I mean, whose fault it was and why it happened, I get all that. But at the end of the day, my whole point was you're trading for a 41-year-old quarterback. Injury risk increases. And unfortunately, he did get injured. But getting back with the Joe D thing, look, Elijah Moore hasn't been as good as I thought he would be, but he'll be at minimum a 700-800 yard per year receiver. Nothing wrong with that. That's a quality player. That's a solid starter. But character issues. Pinnock, no character issues there that I know of. And even Michael Carter, it wasn't so much character. Michael Carter was just fed up with sitting behind Dalvin Cook. I've mentioned this many times before. Nothing, no reporting on this or anything, but sometimes you put two and two together. Michael Carter was on the roster one day. The Jets hold a team meeting the next day, and then the following day, the Jets release him. Like, you're going to tell me he didn't say something in that meeting? Like, hey, any chance I can get some carries over this guy who's averaging 2.1 and I'm averaging 4.3 or whatever? So I think he probably spoke up and said some things that the Jets didn't want to hear, and they let Michael Carter go. But what I'm not saying Michael Carter is going to run for 1,200 yards this year. I'm saying Michael Carter is another good quality backup depth player, but who can catch the ball out of the backfield as well, that Joe Douglas found. But now you look at Joe Douglas, his recent classes, you don't have these Elijah Moore types. You don't have guys who put themselves before the team. It's like, and even like, I don't mean to trash Becton, because I love Becton, love the pick. I still don't trash the guy. As far as I'm concerned, He looked all world before the injury. Yes, he could have done some things better. He could have taken his rehab more seriously. I don't deny that. But he's a young guy, made some mistakes, but still, player-wise, phenomenal. Again, as a rookie. But if you look at the way things transpired with him, he became disheartened with the way things were going with the Jets. Getting moved around from left to right and all this. And again, I'm not absolving him. I'm not saying he did nothing wrong. The Jets may have gotten a little bit fed up with some of the stuff that was going on. He ballooned up to 400 pounds. Not good, right? But either way, the point with Douglas is that even some of his guys that have gone, if you look at his hit rate, and we're just talking about guys who are still here and either playing well or guys who we believe can play well, like Jamie Sherwood's a really good example, and I've talked about this. I think Jamie Sherwood's a starter. He's just on a team where he's not going to start. But I think he's ready to be an NFL starting linebacker. But you get some of these guys who have left, and the Joe Douglas hit rate goes up even more. Again, talking strictly about identifying NFL talent, looking at a guy and saying, I think he can play. And Joe Douglas, again, hits on about half his picks. But if you throw in Pinnock, if you throw in Carter, if you throw in Elijah Moore, and listen, I get today's modern day, everybody knows everything. And the number of times I've talked about this, there are so many fans that treat players, or they have two categories for players, all pro and garbage. That's it. If you're not an all pro, you suck. Elijah Moore, 800 yards. Oh, that sucks. No, it doesn't suck. It's a productive NFL receiver. Right? Jason Pinnock sucks. Look, Jason Pinnock's got some holes in his game. He's a late round guy. I get it, but he was a starter last year and will probably be in the league for a little while. If the Jets hadn't found a better player, Tony Adams, Pinnock's probably still a Jet, and we're counting him as a hit. Well, let's count Tony Adams as a hit. So there are some guys here. There are some guys who have left here, but it looks like Joe Douglas maybe learned a lesson and said, you know what, we're going to prioritize character and work a little bit more than we did in the past. And the thing with Becton, like I said, I'm not knocking him, but I do wonder, what did the Jets get from the coaches at Louisville? In terms of work ethic, and if there were issues there. I mean, water under the bridge doesn't matter really to keep going over it. But my whole point here is that if you look at Joe Douglas's hit rate, and if you look at, again, purely from a identifying and drafting talent perspective, it's even better than it looks on paper, or even better than we talk about. However, identifying talented players minus some character concerns, there are some misses early on. But again, the last couple years, it does appear, we haven't seen any issues, complaints, whining from any of the guys they've drafted. So maybe that's sort of moved up their list of, when they're prioritizing a player, maybe characters moved up a little bit. Let's see. Bernard again in the chat. He was injured before he was here. He was injured the year before. Bernard, he had the thumb. He played through it, but it clearly affected his play through a career high in interceptions and all that. So I understand that, and I get it. It's just, as I said, my concern was guys can be iron. You know who's the ultimate Iron Man? Brett Favre. You know what happened when he came to the Jets? Tore his bicep, played through it, and couldn't throw a spiral. Just ducks flying all over the field. So I get it, but at some point, Father Time's going to catch up, and you're not going to be Iron Man anymore. I do what you mean, though. Let's see. Trade Reddick for better than we gave up for him. I want him here, but not if he puts. Well, here's the thing, John. You have to believe Philly made him available to everybody. And actually, there was a piece the other day, I forget who wrote it, that said every team, once teams knew Haason Reddick was available, every team that called hung up when they were told what he was asking, which is $28 million a year, I guess, is what he's looking for. So every team that was told he's going to hold out if you don't give him 28, they all said no, thank you. So how do the Jets turn to the same 30 teams and offer the same guy who they all just said no to? And I think the only route to a trade, I'm not saying that, I don't think they're going to trade him. It's a win now year. He's a big piece of it. They're not going to. If they were going to, it would take a team that loses somebody to injury between now and the start of the season and calls up and says, hey, what do you want for Haason Reddick? And maybe you can entertain that. So Reddick won't be getting traded, at least in my opinion. We'll see. But who could be getting traded? So not a lot of huge names, but if we're talking about moving guys for late picks, um, the Jets. It's nice. The Jets are now a good enough football team. They might have some guys the teams will come calling for as the preseason winds down. Um, Bernard Reddick has no power right now. Agreed. That's what Reddick. The only thing is, are the Jets going to feel the pressure? Because it does seem that universally. Well, I shouldn't say universally, but there are a lot of folks, a lot of football people, a lot of analysts who are dogging the Jets for this, saying they messed this up. I'm not ready to say that without knowing, and we're not going to know. But what the Jets were told, based on what Reddick said in the presser, I believe the Jets, and that they assured the Jets he would be here, and he then changed his mind. Let's see. Do I think he's going to call it a locker room? No, not at all, John. These guys, listen, all these guys want to get paid. That's it. Every player wants every teammate to make as much money as possible. Very, very, very rare that you see a player, looking at another guy's money situation and commenting on it and caring. He'll show up. They'll hug, high five, dap it up, whatever, and get out there and play. There will be zero animosity when he shows up. Especially holding out training camp. Guys aren't going to care about that. As far as what I was saying, possible trade bait. The Jets, again, in years past, there's never really, well, up until, prior to Joe Douglas, it was hard to find 53 guys who you thought were worthy of being on a roster. Now there's, it's a little bit crowded. It's a little bit crowded in there. And one guy that who I already mentioned, of course, you look at Izzy. Sorry, I'm just pulling something up. Yeah, you look at Izzy right now, and if he's playing better, and the Jets feel like Isaiah Davis is ready to step in and play, because we've seen that he can pass block. We've seen that he's a hard downhill runner. We've seen that he's got really good feet. He's elusive. So as a third back, he could be your guy. So if someone calls and asks for Izzy, but again, Izzy would have to do something in this final preseason game. Just continue doing what he's doing. Average a nice chunk per play. If he breaks a big one, that would obviously that would go a long way. But Izzy's a guy that teams may call about. But Austin Seibert, I mentioned this when he hit the game winner in the first game, and I've talked about it a couple times since then. Is that Seibert's a guy who is a veteran kicker. The Jets are giving him every opportunity to impress and show up on other people's radar, so that maybe come week 1, or after the final preseason game, if teams are struggling to find a kicker, I mean, you hope 2 teams are struggling to find a kicker, and maybe you get 1 or 2 offers for a day 3 pick, and then go from there. Let's see here, and last one to touch on, and actually what's Haason Reddick? I'm not sure what I don't know if that's a typo, Bernard. So let's see here. I'm just trying to look at the last name, and we talked about this recently on a show. Myself and Dylan Terraman. We talked about Jamie Sherwood as a guy who has played really well. Who I mentioned earlier, and is a guy to play much. Oh, excuse me, there. Who's in position to play much better football this year, but it's just in a logjam. And if not Sherwood, Surratt, Barnes is playing well. I don't think he'll go anywhere. He's not really done enough to impress enough. Sherwood would probably be the guy that has the most value based on the fact he's been doing it a few years now, been in the league a few years, gets better every year, super athletic. He's able to cover. But Sherwood also has the athleticism Surratt also has the ability to cover. I'm not so sure about Barnes. He might be sort of third there. And Egwavon, again, you're probably not going to get anything for him in a deal. But as we said a few weeks ago, Sherwood is one to look at. And I think with Barnes and Surratt both playing well, maybe a team that needs somebody in that spot will be willing to make a call and make an offer. But that'll wrap this one up. Just wanted to hop on, talk a little bit about this. Let's see, what's on Corley? What's Tooths on Corley? Did you mean something else besides Tooths, Bernard? before I go here. Okay, we'll wrap it up. Feel free to comment, Bernard, and I'll jump on and I'll respond to any messages down in the comments. Like, subscribe, all that. Like I said, check out JetNation.com. Give me a follow at JNRadio_Glenn. And that'll do it for this one. We'll be back Wednesday night for a full show. Hopefully, all three of us. Believe Chris Schubert is back from his trip. I'm back from my trip. Dylan Terraman, I believe, is available. So the plan is for all three of us. We'll see how that goes. And Bernard says that. So what's on Corley? I mean, really, Corley's a guy. He hasn't had a ton of targets in the preseason, but we've seen them ask him to do what he did in college. A lot of quick hitters or a few quick hitters and tunnel screens and things like that. The blocking hasn't been great, so we haven't seen him make any plays, any big plays. He had the great catch in week one, catching the ball that went through Kuntz's hands. Kuntz is a guy who's not really helping himself a great deal this preseason. Not sure. Final game, not sure. No word from the Jets, from Saleh on starters, who will play, who will not. Excuse me. We'll have to wait and see on that. My gut says they don't play anyone. We'll find out, but that'll wrap this one up. See you Wednesday night, Jets fans. Have a good one.